Robert Chen had been living in the Riverside Meadows neighborhood for exactly 3 months and 2 weeks. After spending 25 years doing a job that often kept him up at night, he'd finally saved enough to buy a decent house in what seemed like a quiet suburban community. The kind of place where people actually waved at each other and kids rode bikes down the sidewalk without worry. He'd kept mostly to himself since moving in, which wasn't unusual for him. Years of working in law enforcement had taught him the value of privacy. When neighbors asked what he did for a living, he'd simply say he worked for the city and change the subject. No need to make things complicated with details about being a detective chief. People either got weird around cops or suddenly wanted to tell him about every parking ticket they'd ever gotten. The house still had that new owner smell, and boxes were stacked in the garage like a cardboard city. Robert had been meaning to deal with them for weeks, but work kept getting in the way. Finally, on a beautiful Saturday morning in late spring, he decided enough was enough. The sun was shining, birds were doing their thing, and he had a rare weekend off. Time to clear out the clutter. He dragged a folding table onto the driveway around 8 in the morning and started hauling stuff out. Old furniture from his previous apartment that didn't fit the new place. Books he'd read 3 times already. Kitchen gadgets his ex-wife had insisted they needed but never used. A lamp that looked like it belonged in a disco. The usual stuff people accumulate over the years without realizing it. By 9:30, he had a pretty decent setup going. He'd even made a sign on cardboard that said, "Garage sale, everything must go," and stuck it at the end of the driveway. A few neighbors had already stopped by. Mrs. Henderson from across the street bought a set of mixing bowls and chatted about her grandkids. Tom from next door picked up some tools and mentioned he'd been meaning to introduce himself properly. A young couple from down the block scored the disco lamp, which honestly made Robert happy because that thing had been haunting him. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly, as it turned out. Around 10 o'clock, Robert noticed a woman marching up his driveway with the kind of purpose that usually meant trouble. She was probably in her mid-50s, wearing white capri pants that looked like they'd never seen a wrinkle and a pink polo shirt with some kind of embroidered logo. Her blonde hair was styled in that specific way that requires standing appointments and a lot of hairspray. Designer sunglasses perched on her head like a tiara. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to ruin your day. "Are you the homeowner?" Robert wiped his hands on his jeans and smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" She didn't return the smile. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started tapping at the screen. "I'm Linda Morrison. I'm the president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association." She said it the way someone might announce they were the Queen of England. "Nice to meet you," Robert said, still being friendly because that's what you do when someone introduces themselves. "Just having a little garage sale to clear out some—" "That's exactly why I'm here." Linda cut him off, her fingers still busy on her phone. She was taking pictures of his garage sale, of his driveway, of his house. Click, click, click. "You're in violation of HOA regulations." Robert felt his smile fade a bit. "I'm sorry, what?" Linda lowered her phone and looked at him like he'd just asked her to explain basic math. Section 7, subsection 4 of the Riverside Meadows Community Standards clearly states that all garage sales, yard sales, or private sales must be approved by the HOA board at least 14 days in advance. You need to submit a community sale request form, pay the $50 processing fee, and if approved, sales are only permitted on Sundays between noon and 3 p.m. For a moment, Robert just stared at her. He'd dealt with a lot of absurd situations in his career, but this was entering new territory. "I didn't receive any information about that when I moved in." "Ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them," Linda said, tucking her phone into her designer purse. The kind that probably cost more than his first car. "All homeowners receive a welcome packet with complete HOA bylaws and regulations." "Well, I never got one," Robert said, keeping his voice calm and level. Years of dealing with difficult people had taught him that staying cool was always the best approach. "This is the first I'm hearing about any of this." Linda's perfectly penciled eyebrows went up. "That's not my problem. The rules apply to everyone equally." She pulled out a small notebook and started writing something. "I'm issuing you a formal citation. The fine for an unauthorized sale is $500. You need to shut this down immediately." A young couple who'd been browsing his stuff suddenly found somewhere else to be. Tom, who'd been chatting with another neighbor on the sidewalk. looked over with concern. Mrs. Henderson had paused on her way back from checking her mailbox. Watching the scene unfold. $500? Robert asked, not quite believing what he was hearing. For having a garage sale on a Saturday morning? For having an unauthorized, unapproved sale in violation of community standards, Linda corrected him, her pen moving across the paper. Standards that exist to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics for everyone's benefit. Robert took a slow breath. Okay, I'd like to see a copy of these bylaws you're talking about, and I'd like documentation of when this welcome packet was supposedly delivered to my address. Linda's mouth pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to people questioning her. That much was obvious. You can request copies from the HOA management office. There's a $10 fee per document requested. $10 to see the rules I'm apparently breaking? Administration fees, Linda said, like that explained everything. She ripped the page from her notebook and held it out to him. You have 48 hours to pay the fine and submit an explanation of corrective actions. If you continue the sale, the fine increases to $1,000 per day. Robert took the paper, scanning it quickly. It looked official enough, with the HOA letterhead and everything, but something about the whole situation felt off. In his line of work, you developed an instinct for when something wasn't quite right. This had that feeling all over it. I'll shut down for today, Robert said carefully. But I'm going to need to review those bylaws and discuss this with the board. When's the next HOA meeting? Board meetings are monthly and attendance is by invitation only, Linda said, already turning to leave. You'll receive notification if your presence is required. Have a good day. She clicked away in her expensive sandals, leaving Robert standing in his driveway holding a citation for $500. Tom walked over, shaking his head. Man, I'm sorry, Tom said quietly. I should have warned you about her. Linda's been on a rampage lately. She goes after everyone for something. Mrs. Henderson joined them, her face pinched with sympathy. She fined us $3,000 last month because we painted our shutters cream instead of ivory. Cream. You can't even tell the difference unless you hold up a paint chip. Robert looked down at the citation, then at his garage sale spread across the driveway. The disco lamp was gone, which was good, but apparently the freedom to sell his own stuff from his own property came with a price tag he hadn't expected. I think I need to do some research, Robert said, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. He had no idea yet just how deep this situation would go, or how his professional skills were about to become very personally relevant. All he knew was that something about Linda Morrison and her aggressive enforcement of garage sale regulations didn't add up. And after 25 years of investigating things that didn't add up, he wasn't about to just pay a fine and forget about it. The disco lamp might be gone, but Robert's problems were just getting started. Robert thought the garage sale incident would blow over. He'd packed up his stuff, done some online research about HOA laws in his state, and figured he'd handle it at the next board meeting. Maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe Linda was having a bad day. Maybe she'd calm down once he explained things properly. He was wrong on all counts. 3 days after the garage sale, a certified letter arrived. Robert had to sign for it, which immediately told him this wasn't going to be good news. The mail carrier gave him that look, the one that said she'd delivered enough of these to know they never contained party invitations. Inside was a formal notice of violation on HOA letterhead, written in language that sounded like it had been copied from a law textbook. The fine was still $500, but now there was additional language about failure to comply with immediate cessation, orders, and flagrant disregard for community standards. They gave him 10 days to pay or face additional enforcement actions. Robert put the letter on his kitchen counter and stared at it while drinking his morning coffee. The thing that bothered him most wasn't the money, though $500 for a garage sale was ridiculous. It was the tone. The aggressive, threatening tone that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform. He decided to visit the HOA management office listed on the letterhead. It was in a small business park 20 minutes away, tucked between a tax preparation place and a martial arts studio. The woman at the front desk was friendly enough, but when he asked to see the community bylaws and the record of his welcome packet delivery, she got nervous. I'll need to check with management, she said, picking up the phone. After 15 minutes of waiting in a chair that had definitely seen better days, she came back with a thick binder. Here are the bylaws. You can review them here, but copies are $10 per section. Robert spent an hour reading through the thing. Sure enough, there was a section about garage sales requiring approval, but there were also sections about how fines were supposed to work, about appeal processes, about board meeting attendance. None of it matched what Linda had told him. According to the bylaws, homeowners had the right to attend any board meeting, not just by invitation. They also had the right to appeal any fine within 30 days. "Can I get a copy of the welcome packet that was sent to my address?" he asked. The receptionist typed on her computer, her face getting more worried with each passing second. I'm not seeing a record of that in the system. Let me check with my supervisor." Another 20 minutes passed. When she returned, she looked apologetic. "We don't have a delivery confirmation for your address. Sometimes there are gaps in the records when properties change hands." Robert made mental notes of everything. No delivery confirmation. Bylaws that contradicted what Linda had told him. A receptionist who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the whole situation. His detective instincts were humming now. The next week, things got worse. Robert came home from work one evening to find another certified letter waiting. This one claimed his trash bins were visible from the street on a non-collection day, which violated Section 12, Subsection 8 of the Community Standards. The fine was $250. The thing was, his trash bins were behind his fence. In his backyard. Not visible from the street unless you walked onto his property and looked over the fence, which would technically be trespassing. He took photos with his phone, documenting everything from multiple angles. The bins weren't visible from the street. They weren't visible from the sidewalk. They weren't even visible from his own driveway unless you stood in a very specific spot. 2 days later, another letter. His grass was apparently a quarter-inch too tall according to HOA standards. Another $250 fine. Robert had literally mowed his lawn the previous weekend. He'd seen neighbors with grass twice as tall as his. Then came the parking violation. According to Linda's latest letter, his car was improperly positioned in his driveway, creating an aesthetic disruption to neighborhood harmony. The car was parked straight in his own driveway, exactly where any normal person would park their car. Each letter was written in that same aggressive, legal-sounding language. Each one demanded payment within 10 days. The fines were now totaling $1,500, and Robert hadn't actually done anything wrong. He started paying closer attention to the neighborhood. Walking around in the evenings after work, he noticed plenty of homes with visible trash bins. Grass that was definitely longer than his. Cars parked at odd angles. But none of those homes were getting certified letters. Tom caught him during one of these walks and pulled him aside. "Dude, she's targeting you. This is what she does." "Why me specifically?" Robert asked. Tom glanced around like he was worried someone might hear. "You stood up to her. Most people just pay whatever she says because it's easier than fighting. But you asked questions. You wanted to see the bylaws. Linda doesn't like that." Mrs. Henderson joined the conversation, having wandered over from her garden. She did the same thing to the Kowalskis 2 years ago. Fined them for everything she could think of until they just gave up and moved. Nice family, too. 3 kids. And the Patels, Tom added. They fought back harder, got lawyers involved. Eventually won, but it cost them thousands in legal fees. More than the fines would have been. Robert felt his jaw tighten. How does she get away with this? "She's got the board in her pocket," Mrs. Henderson said sadly. "Her brother-in-law is the HOA lawyer. He rubber stamps everything she wants. Most of the other board members are either her friends or too scared to say anything." Over the next few days, Robert learned more. The young couple with the disco lamp stopped by to apologize for running away during the garage sale incident. They'd been fined $1,800 the previous year for painting their front door navy blue instead of the approved shade of black. Another neighbor mentioned Linda had pushed through new bylaws, giving herself broader enforcement powers. Several people quietly admitted they were paying fines they didn't think were fair just to avoid more trouble. The neighborhood lived in fear of Linda Morrison, and that didn't sit right with Robert at all. He started documenting everything systematically. Photos of his property, copies of all the letters, screenshots of emails. He noted the dates, times, and circumstances of each alleged violation. He compared his property to others in the neighborhood, photographing homes that had actual violations but weren't being cited. What really caught his attention was the financial angle. The HOA collected dues from every homeowner, plus all these fines Linda was constantly issuing. That money had to go somewhere. But when he requested financial records at the management office, he was told they were only available to board members. That wasn't what the bylaws said. According to the actual written rules, any homeowner could request financial records with reasonable notice. But when he pointed this out, he got the runaround. Something was definitely wrong here. The aggressive enforcement, the selective targeting, the lack of financial transparency, Linda's expensive clothes and car that seemed above what an HOA president should afford. In Robert's experience, when people acted this defensive and aggressive, they were usually hiding something. He sat at his kitchen table one night, looking at the stack of certified letters. The fines now totaled $2,000. For a garage sale he'd shut down immediately. Trash bins that weren't visible, grass that wasn't too long, and a car parked normally in his own driveway. Robert had spent 25 years investigating people who thought they were above the law. People who abused their power. People who targeted the vulnerable and counted on nobody fighting back. He dealt with criminals who were smart, organized, and careful about covering their tracks. But he'd never dealt with an HOA president before. He picked up his laptop and started doing what he did best. Background checks were second nature to him. Public records were his playground. And if Linda Morrison thought she could bully him into submission with threatening letters and made-up fines, she'd picked the wrong house to target. The certified letters kept coming, but Robert stopped being worried about them. He had a new project now, and unlike Linda, he actually knew how to investigate people properly. In his career, he'd learned one important lesson. The more aggressively someone tried to shut you down, the more likely it was they had something serious to hide. Linda's escalating campaign wasn't just petty tyranny. It was desperation dressed up as authority, and Robert was about to find out why. Robert spent his evenings doing homework. Not the kind he'd assigned to criminals over the years, but close enough. He started with the basics, the kind of stuff anyone could access if they knew where to look. Public records were his bread and butter, and Linda Morrison was about to become his most interesting research project. First, he pulled property records for Linda's house. She lived 4 streets over in one of the bigger homes in Riverside Meadows. The place was valued at around $700,000. Not unusual for the neighborhood, but he made a note of it. Then he started looking at vehicle registrations. Linda drove a Mercedes SUV that was only 2 years old, and her husband had a BMW sedan. Again, not necessarily suspicious, but worth noting. What really caught his attention was the business registration search. Linda's name appeared on several LLCs, which wasn't unusual for someone involved in real estate or property management. But the names were interesting. Riverside Property Services, Meadows Maintenance Solutions, Community Landscaping Enterprises. They all sounded like the kind of vendors an HOA might hire. He cross-referenced the names with the limited financial information he'd managed to get from the management office. The woman at the front desk, whose name was Kelly, had been sympathetic enough to print him a summary sheet showing major HOA expenditures for the past year. She'd done it quietly, like she was worried about getting in trouble. Riverside Property Services appeared 3 times. Meadows Maintenance Solutions was on there twice. Community Landscaping Enterprises showed up monthly. The amounts weren't huge individually, but they added up. $50,000 to Riverside Property. Services for emergency repairs. $32,000 to Meadows. Maintenance for seasonal upkeep. Monthly payments of $3,000 to Community Landscaping. Robert sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. It could be legitimate. People owned businesses. HOAs hired vendors. But something felt off about the whole setup. He decided to do a drive around the neighborhood during his lunch break the next day. If the HOA was paying for monthly landscaping, he should be able to see evidence of it. Professional crews, regular maintenance, that kind of thing. What he found instead was pretty much nothing. Most homeowners seemed to maintain their own yards. He saw exactly one landscaping crew the entire week, and they were working on a private residence, not common areas. The neighborhood had a small entrance with some bushes and a sign, but it didn't look like it required $3,000 a month in maintenance. Maybe $300 would be generous. The emergency repairs were harder to track, but Robert started talking to neighbors more. Casually, not like he was investigating. Just friendly conversation. Nobody could remember any major emergency repairs happening in the past year. Tom mentioned that the community pool pump had broken last summer, and it had taken weeks to get Fixed. Mrs. Henderson said the playground, equipment near her house had a broken swing for 6 months before anyone dealt with it. $50,000 in emergency repairs that nobody could remember, monthly landscaping bills for work that wasn't being done, maintenance services for maintenance that wasn't happening. Robert's detective brain was firing on all cylinders now. He reached out to an old colleague, someone he'd worked with for years in the financial crimes unit. Her name was Detective Ramirez, and she'd forgotten more about embezzlement schemes than most people ever learned. They met for coffee, and Robert explained the situation, careful not to make it official. Just a concerned homeowner asking for advice from a friend. Ramirez listened, stirring her coffee slowly. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what's funny?" she finally said. "I've heard that name before. Linda Morrison." Robert felt his pulse quicken. "In what context?" "We've had her on our radar for about 6 months," Ramirez said quietly. "Nothing official yet, just preliminary investigation. We've been building a case, but it's slow going. HOA fraud is tricky because the victims don't always realize they're victims. They just think their HOA president is really dedicated." She explained that the state's financial crimes unit had received a tip about irregularities in Riverside Meadows' HOA finances. Nothing concrete, just enough to start looking. But they'd been struggling because HOA members were either loyal to Linda or too scared of her to cooperate. The few people who had concerns were worried about retaliation. "She's smart," Ramirez said. "Everything looks legitimate on the surface. Real LLCs, proper invoices, legitimate-looking contracts. But when you dig deeper, it all connects back to her or her family members. Her brother-in-law isn't just the HOA lawyer. He's also a silent partner in 2 of those companies. Her cousin owns a third. They've been funneling money out for years." Robert felt anger building in his chest. "How much are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate based on what we've found so far? Around $200,000 over 3 years, but we think it's more. $200,000. Stolen from homeowners who were just trying to maintain a nice neighborhood. People like Mrs. Henderson on a fixed retirement income. Young families trying to make ends meet. All of them paying HOA dues that were supposed to go toward making the community better, not funding Linda's luxury lifestyle." "Why the aggressive enforcement?" Robert asked. "The constant fines and citations?" Ramirez smiled grimly. "Classic misdirection. If she's constantly playing the strict enforcer, constantly seen as the person keeping standards high, nobody questions whether she's good at her job. Plus, those fines go into HOA accounts that she controls. Most people pay them just to avoid hassle. The money doesn't always get properly recorded, so she's pocketing fine money too. That's the theory. Hard to prove without access to complete records, which of course she controls." Ramirez took a sip of her coffee. "The real problem is that we need someone on the inside. Someone she's already targeted, someone who has standing to ask questions and demand answers. Someone who isn't afraid of her." Robert met her eyes. "You need someone like me." "I can't officially ask you to do anything," Ramirez said carefully. "This isn't your jurisdiction and you're personally involved now. But if a concerned homeowner happened to exercise his legal rights to review HOA documents and attend board meetings, and if that homeowner happened to notice things that didn't add up, well, that would be interesting information." They talked for another hour. Ramirez explained what they had so far, what they still needed, and how HOA embezzlement cases typically worked. The key was documentation. Invoices that didn't match actual work performed. Payments to companies that didn't have proper business licenses. Contracts that were never properly bid out or approved. Robert left the coffee shop with a new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his garage sale anymore or even his bogus fines. This was about an entire neighborhood being victimized by someone who'd turned a volunteer position into a criminal enterprise. That evening, he requested a formal HOA board meeting to dispute his fines. According to the bylaws that Linda kept citing, he had that right. He sent the request via certified mail to make sure there was a paper trail. The response came 3 days later. The board would meet in 2 weeks. His attendance was permitted but not required. The tone was dismissive, like they were doing him a favor. Robert spent those 2 weeks preparing. He gathered every piece of documentation he could find. He talked to more neighbors, learning about other people who'd been targeted. He discovered that the Kowalski family had been fined almost $10,000 before they finally moved. The Patels had spent $7,000 in legal fees fighting Linda before they gave up. Another family had paid $5,000 in fines over 2 years for violations that were either imaginary or ridiculously petty. He also learned something else interesting. Linda had recently bought a vacation condo in Florida. She'd taken 3 cruises in the past year. Her daughter's wedding last summer had been featured in a local magazine, and it looked like it had cost more than most people's annual salary, all on a household income that, according to public tax records, shouldn't support that lifestyle. The pieces were coming together. The fake vendor companies, the missing maintenance work, the aggressive fine collection, the expensive lifestyle. Linda Morrison had turned the HOA into her personal bank account, and she'd been getting away with it for years because nobody had the courage or knowledge to challenge her. But Robert wasn't nobody. He was a detective chief with 25 years of experience investigating people who thought they were smarter than the law. He'd taken down organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and white-collar criminals who'd covered their tracks far better than Linda ever had. She'd made one critical mistake. She'd picked on someone who actually knew how to investigate financial crimes, and worse for her, she'd made it personal with those escalating fines and threatening letters. The board meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. Robert marked it on his calendar and continued his preparation. He wasn't going to that meeting as an angry homeowner complaining about unfair treatment. He was going as someone who'd just uncovered what might be the biggest HOA fraud case in the county. And Linda Morrison had no idea what was coming. The community center meeting room was packed. Robert arrived 15 minutes early and was surprised to see at least 40 people already there. Way more than usually showed up for HOA meetings. Word had gotten around that someone was actually challenging Linda Morrison, and people wanted to see what would happen. Tom gave him a subtle thumbs up from across the room. Mrs. Henderson sat near the front, looking nervous but determined. Robert recognized other neighbors he'd talked to over the past 2 weeks. The couple with the disco lamp. The young family who'd been fined for their door color. Even the Patels had shown up, which said something considering how much legal trouble they'd been through. Linda sat at the head table with 4 other board members, looking completely in control. She wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Robert's monthly mortgage payment. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. She looked like someone who'd never worried about anything in her life. Her brother-in-law, the HOA attorney, sat beside her reviewing papers. His name was Brian, and he had that slick lawyer look that Robert had seen 1,000 times. Expensive suit, gold watch, the kind of fake smile that never reached the eyes. Linda called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. She went through the usual boring stuff first, probably hoping people would leave. Approval of last month's minutes. Discussion of a new speed bump proposal. Update on pool maintenance. Her voice had that fake, cheerful quality people use when they're trying to sound professional. Finally, after 30 minutes of mind-numbing routine business, she got to Robert's appeal. "We have a homeowner dispute to address," Linda said, glancing at her notes. "Robert Chen has requested a hearing regarding fines issued for multiple violations of community standards. Mr. Chen, you have 10 minutes to present your case." Robert stood up, carrying a folder full of documents. His heart was beating fast, but his voice was calm when he spoke. 25 years of testifying in court had taught him how to handle pressure. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the board," he began. "I'm here to dispute $2,000 in fines that I believe were issued improperly, and in some cases for violations that never actually occurred." He walked through each citation systematically. The garage sale he'd shut down within an hour of being told there was a problem. The trash bins that weren't visible from the street, supported by photos from multiple angles. The grass that was perfectly within regulation height. The car that was parked normally in his own driveway. "I have photos documenting all of these alleged violations," Robert said, holding up his phone. "I also have photos of at least a dozen other properties in this neighborhood with similar or worse conditions that have not been cited." "This suggests selective enforcement." Linda's smile got tighter. "Mr. Chen, we enforce violations as they're reported to us. If you'd like to report other violations, you're welcome to submit them in writing." "That brings me to my next point," Robert continued. "I requested the HOA bylaws and was told I never received a welcome packet. The management office has no record of delivering one to my address. According to Section 3 of the bylaws, Homeowners cannot be fined for violations they weren't properly informed about. Brian, the lawyer, leaned over and whispered something to Linda. She nodded. Administrative oversights don't negate the rules themselves, Linda said. You've been informed now. Robert could see people in the audience shifting in their seats, paying closer attention. He'd been building to this moment, and now it was time. I've done some research over the past couple weeks, he said, his tone still calm and measured. I wanted to understand how the HOA operates, where our dues money goes, that kind of thing. So I reviewed the financial summary that's supposed to be available to all homeowners. What I found was interesting. Linda's expression changed slightly. Just a flicker, but Robert caught it. The first crack in her perfect composure. According to the records, the HOA paid $50,000 to Riverside Property Services for emergency repairs last year. But I've talked to dozens of neighbors, and nobody can remember any major emergency repairs. I drove around the entire neighborhood. I checked with local contractors. No emergency repairs happened. The room was dead quiet now. Everyone was listening. The HOA also pays $3,000 a month to Community Landscaping Enterprises. Robert continued. But we don't have monthly professional landscaping. I've been here 3 months and I've seen one landscaping crew and they were working on a private home. Brian stood up. Mr. Chen, this hearing is about your fines, not an audit of HOA finances. You're out of order. Actually, I'm not, Robert said, pulling out a copy of the bylaws. Section 15 states that any homeowner can raise concerns about financial management during any board meeting. I'm exercising that right. He turned back to the board, and more importantly to the audience. Those 2 companies, along with a third called Meadows Maintenance Solutions, are all registered to the same address. That address happens to be Linda Morrison's home. She owns those companies, or family members of hers do. The HOA has paid these companies over $200,000 in the past 3 years. The room erupted. People started talking over each other. Mrs. Henderson gasped. Tom looked shocked. The Patels were nodding like this confirmed everything they'd suspected. Linda shot to her feet, her face red. This is outrageous. You can't just throw around accusations like that. Those are legitimate businesses providing legitimate services. Then show us the work, Robert said simply. Show us invoices with detailed descriptions of what was done. Show us before and after photos. Show us signed contracts that were properly bid out according to HOA bylaws. Show us anything that proves $200,000 worth of actual work was performed. Brian was shuffling through papers frantically. Linda looked like she wanted to jump across the table. I don't have to justify HOA business to someone who's been here 3 months and can't even follow basic community rules, Linda snapped. You're just trying to deflect from your own violations. I'm just asking questions that any homeowner has the right to ask, Robert said. He turned to face the crowd. Anyone else here think it's weird that we're paying thousands of dollars a month for services nobody can see? Anyone else want to know where their HOA dues are actually going? Hands started going up. Then more hands. Within seconds, half the room had their hands raised. A man in the back stood up. I was fined $1,500 for leaving my garage door open. Linda said it was 3 separate violations at $500 each. But now I'm wondering if any of that money even went into the HOA account. I paid $2,000 in fines last year, another woman called out, for my fence being 6 inches too tall. I had to replace the whole thing. More people started sharing stories. The room turned into controlled chaos. Years of frustration and suspicion came pouring out. Linda tried to regain control, banging her gavel and demanding order. But nobody was listening to her anymore. Robert waited for the noise to die down a bit. Then he played his final card. There's something else everyone should know, he said quietly, and the room went silent again. I didn't want to bring this up, but given the circumstances, I think it's important for the community to understand who they're dealing with. He paused, letting the tension build. I'm not just a concerned homeowner. I'm Detective Chief Robert Chen. I've spent 25 years with the police department investigating financial crimes, fraud, and embezzlement, and everything I'm seeing here looks exactly like every other embezzlement scheme I've investigated in my career. You could have heard a pin drop. Linda's face went from red to white. Brian, the lawyer, suddenly looked very interested in his paperwork. The other board members were staring at Linda with new expressions, like they were seeing her for the first time. I'm not investigating this officially, Robert continued. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one, at least not yet. But I'm telling you that as a professional with decades of experience in financial crimes, something is very wrong with how this HOA is being managed. The lack of transparency, the missing documentation, the payments to shell companies, the aggressive fine collection without proper accounting, all of it points to systematic financial mismanagement at best, and fraud at worst. Linda finally found her voice. You're abusing your position to intimidate me. This is harassment. This is a homeowner asking to see financial records that I'm legally entitled to review, Robert said calmly. This is a taxpayer wondering why emergency repairs that never happened cost $50,000. This is someone who knows what financial crimes look like, and I'm looking at one right now. Brian grabbed Linda's arm and pulled her aside for a whispered conversation. The other board members were looking at each other in panic. The audience was buzzing with excited conversation. Tom stood up. I move that we suspend all outstanding fines pending a complete independent audit of HOA finances. Second, Mrs. Henderson called out immediately. All in favor? Tom asked, looking at the board. 3 of the 5 board members raised their hands, not even waiting for Linda's approval. They'd clearly had enough. Linda tried one more time to regain control. You can't just, this isn't how this works. You need proper procedure. Actually, Robert said, still calm, according to Section 18 of the bylaws, any homeowner motion that receives a second can be voted on immediately if it pertains to financial oversight or emergency measures. You wrote these rules, Linda. You just never expected anyone to actually read them. The meeting dissolved after that. People surrounded Robert with questions and thank yous. Linda and Brian left quickly through a side door. The other board members stayed behind, looking shell-shocked but also relieved, like they'd been waiting for someone to finally call out what they'd suspected but been too scared to address. Robert went home that night, knowing he'd started something that couldn't be stopped. The truth was coming out. The question now was what Linda would do next and how much worse it would get before it got better. The morning after the board meeting, Robert's doorbell rang at 7:30. He opened it to find Detective Ramirez standing there with 2 other officers and a very official-looking folder. Good morning, she said with a slight smile. We need to move fast. Can we talk inside? Over coffee, Ramirez explained that the board meeting had accelerated everything. After Robert's public presentation, 3 former board members had contacted the Financial Crimes Unit overnight, with information they'd been too scared to share before. One of them had kept copies of invoices that didn't match the work supposedly performed. Another had emails from Linda instructing them to approve payments without asking questions. The thing about people like Linda, Ramirez said, is they get sloppy when they feel powerful. She never thought anyone would challenge her, so she didn't cover her tracks as well as she could have. By 9 a.m., unmarked police cars were parked outside Linda's house. Robert watched from his window as officers entered with search warrants. They'd be looking for financial records, computer files, anything that documented the money trail. Brian the lawyer was apparently being questioned at his office at the same time. The neighborhood was buzzing. Robert's phone kept ringing with calls from news stations wanting interviews. He politely declined. This wasn't about him becoming some kind of hero. It was about making things right. By that afternoon, Linda was arrested. The charges were serious: embezzlement, fraud, theft, and financial elder abuse because some of her victims were retirees on fixed incomes. The news vans showed up. And suddenly, Riverside Meadows was the lead story on every local channel. Robert stayed inside, avoiding the cameras. But he did agree to meet with the remaining board members and a professional HOA management company that had been brought in for emergency oversight. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The actual total wasn't $200,000. It was closer to $240,000 over 4 years. Linda had been incredibly creative with her theft. Fake invoices for work that never happened. Inflated costs for basic maintenance. Payments to companies that existed only on paper. Fine money that was collected but never properly recorded in the books. She'd also been manipulating the budget reports she presented at meetings, showing expenses in vague categories that didn't reveal where the money actually went. Most homeowners had trusted that their elected president was being honest. Why wouldn't they? The management company found other issues too. Legitimate maintenance that had been neglected because Linda claimed there wasn't money in the budget, even though she'd stolen plenty. Safety inspections that hadn't been done. insurance policies that had lapsed. The HOA was actually in financial trouble because so much money had been siphoned off. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Brian lost his law license and faced his own charges for helping Linda set up the shell companies. He'd known exactly what he was doing, and the emails proved it. Two of Linda's family members who'd been running the fake businesses cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for lesser charges. The homeowners held an emergency meeting to elect a new board. This time, everyone paid attention to who was running and what their qualifications were. Tom ended up as the new treasurer because he was an accountant and actually knew how to read financial statements. Mrs. Henderson joined the board too, representing the longtime residents who'd been hurt most by Linda's schemes. Robert was asked to join, but he declined. He'd done what needed to be done, but he wasn't looking for power or recognition. He just wanted a quiet place to live without someone trying to scam him out of money for made-up violations. The most satisfying part came about 6 weeks after the arrest. The new board voted unanimously to refund every fine that Linda had issued in the past 3 years that couldn't be properly documented. Robert got his $2,000 back. The couple with the wrong colored door got their $1,800. Mrs. Henderson got her $3,000 for the cream-colored shutters. The Patels, who'd spent so much on legal fees, received a formal apology and a check for the $5,000 in fines they'd paid. The HOA even reached out to the families who'd moved away because of Linda's harassment. The Kowalskis were contacted in their new state and offered a settlement. It wasn't enough to undo the stress of being driven from their home, but it was something, an acknowledgement that they'd been wronged. As for Linda, she tried to fight the charges at first. Her lawyer argued she'd made bookkeeping errors and judgment mistakes but hadn't intended to steal. That argument fell apart pretty quickly when prosecutors showed the vacation condo she'd bought, the luxury cars, the expensive wedding she'd thrown for her daughter. You don't accidentally buy a beachfront property with bookkeeping errors. Eventually, she took a plea deal. 6 years in prison and full restitution of every dollar she'd stolen. The judge, a woman in her 60s who dealt with plenty of white-collar criminals, didn't show much sympathy during sentencing. "You were in a position of trust," the judge said. "Your neighbors elected you to look after their community, and you betrayed that trust for personal gain. You targeted people who couldn't afford to fight back, who were afraid of you, who trusted you to do the right thing. That makes your crime particularly egregious," Linda cried during sentencing. Robert, who attended with several other neighbors, didn't feel much sympathy. He'd seen too many criminals cry when they got caught. None of those tears had been there when she was threatening people with bogus fines or stealing money from retirees. The case became something of a teaching moment. The state attorney general's office used it in training materials about HOA fraud. Local news did follow up stories about how to spot financial mismanagement in homeowner associations. Other HOA boards in the area suddenly got a lot more interested in financial transparency and independent audits. For Robert and his neighbors, life slowly went back to normal. The new board implemented actual reasonable rules. They hired legitimate contractors who did legitimate work at fair prices. They published detailed financial reports every quarter that anyone could review. They even updated the bylaws to add oversight mechanisms so one person could never have that much unchecked power again. The neighborhood changed in other ways too. People started actually talking to each other without fear of being reported for violations. Someone organized a block party, and almost everyone showed up. Kids played in the streets again without parents worrying that Linda would cite them for sidewalk chalk or bicycles left in yards. Mrs. Henderson told Robert one afternoon that it felt like a weight had been lifted. "We were all so stressed for so long," she said. "Walking on eggshells, worried about every little thing. It's nice to just enjoy living here again." Tom hosted a barbecue at his place and invited half the street. Over burgers and beer, he raised a toast to Robert, to the guy who had a garage sale at exactly the right time. Everyone laughed. Robert just shook his head. "I was just trying to get rid of a disco lamp." "Best garage sale in neighborhood history," the disco lamp couple chimed in. "That lamp is still going strong, by the way. We have it in our basement." The funny thing was, Robert never did have another garage sale. He didn't need to. When neighbors heard he was clearing out stuff, they'd just swing by and ask if he had anything they could use. The items disappeared into homes around the neighborhood without any need for formal sales or HOA approval or any of that nonsense. He'd also become something of a neighborhood consultant. When someone had a question about HOA rules or financial reports, they'd ask Robert. He'd help them understand what they were looking at, making sure everyone knew their rights and responsibilities. Knowledge was power, and Robert made sure his neighbors had the knowledge to never be victimized again. 6 months after the arrest, Robert was working in his front yard when a moving truck pulled up to the house 4 streets over. Linda's house. Her husband had quietly divorced her and sold the place. A young family was moving in, parents with 2 little kids who immediately started exploring their new yard with excitement. Robert walked over to introduce himself. The couple seemed nice, a bit nervous about moving to a new place. He welcomed them to the neighborhood and offered to help if they needed anything. "Is this a good community?" the wife asked. The realtor said there'd been some issues with the HOA. Robert smiled. There were issues, but they got fixed. These days, it's a pretty great place to live. Good neighbors, reasonable rules, and everyone actually looks out for each other. That's good to hear, the husband said, looking relieved. As Robert walked back to his house, he thought about how strange life could be. If Linda hadn't complained about his garage sale, if she hadn't targeted him with those escalating fines, if she'd just left him alone, she'd probably still be running her little criminal enterprise. She could have stolen for years more, but she'd picked the wrong driveway to march up. She'd picked the wrong person to bully, and because of that, an entire neighborhood was better off. Robert still had that disco lamp couple's thank you card on his fridge. It had a picture of the lamp proudly displayed in their basement, with a note that said, "Thanks for the lamp and for everything else." He figured that pretty much summed it up. Sometimes you help people get rid of their clutter. Sometimes you help them get rid of something much worse. Either way, it was nice to know you'd made a difference. And who knows, maybe someday he'd have another garage sale. But this time he'd definitely file the proper paperwork first.